What would you say to middle-aged adult man or woman, who's, maybe in our age cohort, and they have done a great job like you, and they've kind of figured out the journey. What does moving into menopause and andropause look like for them? And are you a fan of using hormones? Like, talk about that.
Yeah, I am a big fan of using hormones, although again, I have pause and I'm using usually conservative approaches and making sure cardiovascular health looks good before we start on something like that. You have to be exercising. You have to be eating whole foods. If you're eating processed foods and you're not moving your body, it's not a good idea to be using hormone replacement. I think it's life-saving a lot of times to use it, but you can't just use that and expect everything to go okay. I think type 1s oftentimes suffer from hormonal imbalances even more than the average person. There's so many young people with PCOS and type 1 diabetes. Like, the correlation there is huge because it's overconsumption of carbohydrate and lack of skeletal muscle that's causing PCOS. And so if you have hormonal imbalances in PMS or PMDD or PCOS, and then you're moving through perimenopause and menopause, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's not going to be fun at all. It's going to be harder than the person next to you that doesn't have type 1 diabetes to deal with also.
Can you repeat what you just said about PCOS and what causes it so people really understand this?
Yeah. So overconsumption of carbohydrates. I think of PCOS in a young person as basically early metabolic syndrome. It's we're eating too many carbohydrates and you're not moving the skeletal muscle enough. And for reasons that still are a little unknown, when that happens and there's blood sugar dysregulation and even mild insulin resistance, the ovaries will overproduce testosterone and DHEA. And that is classic PCOS. You don't have to have cysts on your ovaries. That's not always part of that. But the degree of type 1 diabetes with PCOS is like 5-fold to the average population. So that is what that's about. And if you have hormonal problems in PCOS, it's going to make your transition to perimenopause and menopause more difficult, more challenging.
Yes. And 9 times out of 10, it's what you said. It's metabolic dysfunction. That's at the root core. Because that's the other question I get when I talk about things online. People say, what about PCOS? And I'm like, it's exactly same. Same
Yeah.
rules. Everything goes back to the same rules. Everybody has to play by the same rules. We're human beings. We all abide by the same natural laws of health, right? So, I would add, what you mentioned about the just insurmountable amount of injections that children get at a very young age, and then toxicity. I think that contributes to PCOS as well. And so you've got just kind of it's the mixed bag. And the way I explain it to folks is it just depends on how it decides to present for you, right? We're in this toxic soup of a planet, and everyone's toxic bucket burden is different. And so some of us overflow when we're young. I was hit by a bunch of stuff when I was young, the autoimmune that nobody could figure out. It didn't have a name. Nobody knew what was wrong with me. And so that went on for years and decades before getting that sorted out. And I had almost wished I had something that somebody could have put a finger on and said, it's this.
Right.
But it wasn't until I met my naturopathic mentor who was like, you have to keep your waist circumference in check. You have to exercise all the time. Like every day you have to sweat a little bit, whether that's in the sauna or that's exercise, sweating, whatever. You have to move and build muscle, forget all the chronic cardio, like quit doing steady state cardio and just build muscle. And this was like way back in the early 90s. It was groundbreaking information. He told me to stay away. There was no paleo diet then. There was no carnivore diet. There's none of that. He just said, stop eating white carbs. Like, just stop it. It's not good for you. It's not going to help your hormones. And lo and behold, when I listened to him finally, it took a while, but when I finally adopted what he said and started doing it decades later, everything got much better. So he was onto it, he was onto it early, but he really drove home the waist circumference thing. I didn't understand that for years. I thought it was a vanity thing. And finally he explained it. He's like, no, that's your gauge for your metabolic health, your muscle and your waist circumference. And he also taught me, if someone's not lifting weights, and I say this when patients would walk in the door, my first 3 questions really were like, are you lifting weights regularly? No. Usually the answer is no. I could tell what their waist circumference was or that it was elevated. And if they had elevated blood pressure when my assistant took it, when they entered the office, I knew they had metabolic dysfunction straight up. And I had type 1 diabetics in my practice, and they would, same thing, you know, and they wanted different rules. And I was like, there's not, you have to follow the same rules. Yeah. We all have to have the glucose sink built and functioning, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I think the type 1s, I think it's a very unique chronic illness. And I think a lot of type 1s really feel like no one understands unless you have it, which is partially true. So then we get into this place where we're like, well, it's like them against us. And we're in this, like on this island, you know, and part of that is true. So I understand that, but it's enlightening to remember as a type 1 that you could technically get type 2 also. Like you'd probably pass away before that, but you can have type 1 and have early metabolic syndrome moving towards type 2. Like that, mind blown. We don't want that, you know.